The word of wisdom revelation does not start until verse 4. The first 3 verses introduce the revelation and why it was given. Verse 2 says it was not given as a commandment but guidance for the temporal salvation of the church in the last days. Temporal salvation can be anything from better health to better finances. Being directed to the saints of the last days is indication that this was not given to man in earlier times in history. There is no reason to assume God's people in earlier times, whether those in the Bible or Book of Mormon, lived under its provisions. Thus whether Jesus or the apostles drank wine in the 1st century has no application to whether God's people in the 21st century are to drink wine. Verse 3 says it was given for the weakest of the members of the church. Anyone in the church can follow it and benefit from it. God is concerned about all members and wants to bless everyone. No member can claim that living the word of wisdom is too hard if one commits themselves to it. Verse 4 says, in consequence of evils and designs which do and will exist in the hearts of conspiring men in the last days, that this revelation was given. This establishes the word of wisdom as a unique latter-day revelation. This suggests the revelation would not be necessary if the conspiring men, being referenced, did not exist in the last days. Perhaps these men are conspiring to get the public to misuse or overuse tobacco and alcohol through mass marketing. Get as many people to use it far more often and in more amounts than in times past. I don't believe ancient Jerusalem had a wine store on every corner. We can see the effects over the years of how these substances have been used. In the US alone, hundreds of thousands of people die each year from the misuse of tobacco and alcohol, and that is just part of the problem these things have brought society. These verses speak directly against the saints' use of strong drink or alcohol. Perhaps drinking alcohol in small amounts is not a big deal. Moderation might be fine if 100% of the people could drink in moderation 100% of the time. The problem is that does not happen. Many abuse it and it leads to many problems. To save the weakest among us, the Lord tells all to abstain so that weak can be lifted up and those that are not weak will not be a temptation for those who are weak. Verses 8 is about abstaining from tobacco. We all know the risks of using tobacco today. Back in those days, it was not clear. It says, tobacco is not for the body, neither for the belly. This implies some people would eat it. Not a common practice today, but in those days, some would consume it as a medicine to purge the stomach. The Lord instructs that this is not a good idea. Verse 9 speaks against hot drinks. Despite claims by some critics that all hot drinks were forbidden when the revelation was first given, it was understood early on that it referred to coffee and tea. Joel Johnson heard Joseph Smith say in 1833 that the Lord meant tea and coffee when it came to hot drinks, and Hiram Smith in 1842 also understood hot drinks to be directed at tea and coffee. Temperature was not the issue. Thus it is okay for latter-day saints today to drink hot chocolate, water, milk, but not coffee or tea. The reasons for why coffee and tea are said to be bad for the body is not given. Modern-day studies bounce around on the issue of whether coffee or tea has positive or negative benefits. The Lord just says to avoid it. The modern-day application of the word of wisdom is as much an obedience issue as a health one. Perhaps low consumption of coffee would not be a big deal, but we can see that, like alcohol, people have a hard time avoiding low consumption of it. Verse 10 and 11 says herbs are good for us. This is a case of not avoiding but encouraging us to use these things. Verse 12 to 15 says that all grain is good for the use of man. The word of wisdom does not require a vegetarian or vegan diet. It also allows for the eating of meat but suggests it used sparingly and in times of cold, winter, or famine. Some of this has more application in the 19th century than today. Refrigeration allows for safer storage of meat. In the 19th century, meat could be more harmful to eat due to quicker spoilage. Members including myself are probably guilty of eating too much meat. We should all reduce our intake. This part of the word of wisdom to eat meat sparingly is still viewed as counsel and not a commandment. Nobody is restricted from the LDS temples out of eating too much meat. Verse 16 and 17 says grains and fruits and vegetables are good. One can make a case from this passage that beer can be called a mild drink from barley and should be separated from the strong drink. The Church has classified beer with other alcohol beverages. It's a good thing as beer is the most consumed alcoholic beverage. Perhaps beer would be allowed if it was not promoted and used as it is today. Evil men in the last days turned a drink into the main event in many places and activities. I believe the word of wisdom is less about the harmful substances and more about the wrongful promotion and mass consumption of these things on a regular basis. The revelation finishes up as follows. Verse 18 to 21 gives some promises if one obeys the word of wisdom of better health. One can find many individual cases of people who have lived to a very old age while smoking a lot or drinking lots of booze. One can also find individual cases of latter-day saints who followed the word of wisdom and got sick and died early. Generally, however, it has benefits, as a study by UCLA in 2010 showed. Among the conclusions in this study by this UCLA study are the following. Mormon males had a life expectancy of 84.1 years. 9.8 years longer than that of U.S. white males. Mormon females had a life expectancy of 86.1 years. 5.6 years longer than U.S. white females. Better health is one clear blessing promised in by living the word of wisdom. It was given for the temporal salvation of the saints. There appears to be an additional aspect to it. Verse 21 speaks about the destroying angel, which has clear reference to the Old Testament in Exodus chapter 12. In that story, the angel passes by the children of Israel who had lamb's blood marked on their homes and gave them temporal salvation by not being killed. This blood also was symbolic of the covenant between God and Israel and foreshadowing the atonement of Jesus Christ. Just as the blood was a mark for God's people in Exodus, the word of wisdom is also a mark for God's people in these days. I believe God has used the word of wisdom to mark out or separate his people from the world. Thank you for your time.